They came from the west on a morning in early spring, and I was the first person in my village to see them. This is not a boast. It is simply the fact of where I was standing and what direction I was facing when they crested the ridge above the Kell River. I was 14 years old, and I had climbed to the high pasture before dawn because one of our goats had gone missing, and my father had decided that finding it was my problem. I was sitting on a flat stone, eating bread and watching the western ridge, because the western ridge was where the light came first in the morning, and I had nothing better to do while I waited for it to be light enough to search properly. Two figures appeared on the ridge against the dawn sky. I did not know what they were. I had never seen anything that gave me a category for what they were. They were men in shape, robed, one in a blue so deep it was almost the blue of the sky at the very top of a clear afternoon, one in a blue that was paler, softer, the blue of distances. They were walking with the specific quality of people who have been walking for a very long time and have made their peace with it, not tired exactly, but settled into the motion become a condition rather than an effort. They carried staffs. They were old in the way that old means something different than I had previously understood it to mean, that carries in it not just the accumulation of years, but the accumulation of something else, something I had no word for at 14 and have only imperfect words for now. They saw me before I moved. The one in the deeper blue looked at me with a directness that I felt in my chest before I felt it in my eyes. The specific quality of attention from something that is used to seeing more than the surface of what it looks at. He said something to his companion in a language I didn't know. His companion replied. Then the first one looked back at me and spoke in the trade tongue of the eastern roads. Accented strangely, the house words correct, but arranged in a way that suggested they had been assembled from study rather than learned through use. He asked me if I knew this land. I told him I had grown up in it. He asked if I knew the peoples to the east, the tribes beyond the salt flats, the settled towns along the Ash River, the nomadic groups that ranged the steppe in the seasons when the grass was sufficient. I told him my mother's family were Ash River people, that I had cousins in 3 of the steppe tribes, that I had traveled with my uncle as far east as the great bend in the river the Western maps, if they showed it at all, called the River Running. He looked at his companion again. His companion made a small gesture that I would come to recognize over the years as his specific way of expressing agreement without committing to enthusiasm. The first wizard turned back to me and asked if I would consider traveling with them. I asked where they were going. He said east. I had been looking for a goat. I came home that evening with 2 Istari instead, and the explanation I gave my father was inadequate in ways that are still inadequate now, 60 years later, and I have stopped trying to improve it. My name is Faruz. I was born in the village of Kelmoran on the western edge of Rune, in the early years of the Third Age, into a family that had traded along the eastern roads for 6 generations and had accumulated across those generations a working knowledge of more languages and more peoples and more ways of organizing human life than most Western scholars had any awareness existed. I was not educated in the formal sense. I was educated in the way that families like mine educate their children, through movement and encounter and the specific knowledge that comes from spending time in many different places and paying attention in all of them. This was what they needed. Not a warrior, not a scholar, not a diplomat. Someone who knew the roads and the faces and the specific texture of the Eastern world they had arrived to work in. Someone young enough to travel hard and old enough to be useful. Someone whose family connections gave access to peoples that two strangers from the West, however remarkable, would otherwise approach as outsiders. I was all of these things, and I was available, and I had not yet found a direction of my own. They gave me one. I will not tell you their Western names, not because I do not know them, but because those were not the names they used in the East, and the Eastern names are the names I knew them by, and the names that were true to what they became. I will call them what the peoples of Rune called them, which was the Elder and the Wanderer. Names that emerged from observation rather than assignment, that the Eastern peoples arrived at independently across different regions and in different languages, and that were, in both cases, exactly right. The Elder worked through settled peoples. The Wanderer worked through the moving ones. This was not a division they announced or agreed to formally. It emerged from their natures in the way that things emerge from natures given sufficient time and sufficient freedom. The Elder had a quality of rootedness, of patience with place and with the people of place, that made him suited to the long work of towns and kingdoms and the structures that outlast individual lives. The Wanderer had a quality of motion, of comfort with the provisional and the temporary, that made him suited to the peoples who measured their lives in seasons and migrations and the shifting grammar of the steppe. In the beginning they went everywhere together. I traveled with both of them, carrying their language needs and their introductions, and the specific social knowledge that made the difference between strangers arriving and people arriving who were known to be connected to other people who were worth knowing. I was useful in the practical way of someone who understands the landscape of relationships in a complex territory, who knows not just the names of the villages, but the history of the grudges between them. Not just the titles of the leaders, but the specific vanities and fears that made each one approachable in a different way. The first months were a process of finding what each of us needed from the other. They needed to understand how I moved through the Eastern world, and I needed to understand how to be useful to beings whose capabilities and limitations I had no frame for. I had assumed, in the way of someone who has grown up hearing stories about powerful figures arriving from distant places, that they would want to demonstrate their power, that the work of establishing themselves in the East would involve some display of the specific abilities that made them what they were. They did not operate that way. They listened more than they spoke. They asked questions that were sometimes so basic they seemed naive, and sometimes so precise they seemed to already contain the answer. They observed the way things worked before they attempted to work within them, sitting in markets and council meetings and ordinary evening gatherings with the patient attention of beings that were in no hurry, that had calibrated their sense of urgency to a time scale I was only beginning to understand. I learned more in the first year of traveling with them than in the previous 14 years of being educated by a family that had traveled these roads for generations. Not because they taught me directly, because being in proximity to minds that processed the world the way theirs did changed the quality of my own attention. I started seeing things I had been looking at without seeing. Patterns in how the Eastern markets were structured, the specific ways that the tributary arrangements shaped which families ate well and which did not, the relationship between who controlled water and who controlled everything else. They were not teaching me, but I was learning. I will give you one example from the first year because it stayed with me, and because it illustrates something about how they operated that took me a long time to understand. We stopped for 3 days in a village on the eastern edge of the Salt Flats, a poor place, 20 or 30 families who eked their living from the salt trade and paid a portion of it to a garrison commander 2 days to the north who contributed nothing to the village except the threat of what would happen if the portion was not paid. The village headman was a tired man called Durek, who had spent 30 years managing the gap between what his people had and what was taken from them, and had arrived at a specific kind of exhaustion that comes from solving the same problem for decades without ever solving it. The elder sat with Durek for an entire day. I was present as translator, though the elder's grasp of the local dialect was already sufficient that he needed me less than he let Durek believe he did. He asked Durek about the history of the salt flats, about how the trade routes had changed in his lifetime, about which families had been in the village longest and which had arrived more recently. He asked about the garrison commander, not directly, not with any obvious purpose, but in the way that a question can be embedded in a larger conversation so that answering it feels like ordinary talk rather than information being extracted. By the end of the day, Durek had told the elder everything about the garrison arrangement, the specific mechanisms of the tribute, the families who suffered most under it, and the families who had found ways to suffer less. He had told him things I suspect he had not told anyone, things that lived in the category of understood, but not spoken. When we left, I asked the elder what he intended to do with what Durek had told him. He said he intended to remember it. That memory was the beginning of everything. That you could not address what you did not understand, and you could not understand what you had not heard from the people who lived inside it. I asked if he planned to help Durek. He said he planned to help the salt flats. That Durek was one part of the salt flats, and not the most important part, and that help directed only at the most visible person in a situation tended to leave the situation unchanged when that person was gone. I thought about this for a long time afterward. I am still thinking about it. They learned quickly. Both of them. The speed of their learning was the first indication I had that whatever they were not ordinary men doing an extraordinary thing. They were something else doing a thing that looked ordinary from the outside. Within 2 years, the elder spoke 3 Eastern languages with the fluency of someone who had grown up in them. Within 3 years, the wanderer could navigate the steppe social protocols with a precision that took most outsiders a generation to acquire. They learned the way people learn when learning is not a cognitive challenge, but an act of attention, when the barrier between receiving and understanding is thinner than it is for ordinary minds. I watched them do this, and I noted it, and I filed it alongside everything else I was noting and filing, which was becoming an extensive record. I will tell you what I saw of their actual work, because the work is where the understanding lives. In the 3rd year, we spent 6 months in a town called Ashcorum on the Eastern River, a town of perhaps 4,000 people, whose primary function in the regional economy was as a collection point for the tribute that flowed westward from the smaller settlements to the larger kingdom beyond the salt flats. The tribute collectors arrived twice a year. They took a portion of everything, grain and livestock and metalwork, and a number of young men and women whose specific fates I was told not to ask about, and didn't ask about. The town absorbed this the way it had absorbed it for as long as anyone living could remember, with the specific quality of people who have been doing something long enough that they have stopped noticing that it is a thing being done to them rather than a condition of existence. The elder spent those 6 months doing almost nothing visible. He talked to people. He ate meals with families. He sat with the elders and the craftsmen and the people who kept the town's records, and he asked questions about how things had been arranged and whether they had always been arranged that way, and what people thought about the arrangements. He did not offer alternatives. He did not suggest that anything was wrong. He asked questions in a way that made the people being asked hear their own answers differently than they had heard them before. When we left Ashkorum, I asked him what he had accomplished. He said he had helped some people notice a distinction they had not been making between what was and what had been made to seem like what had always been. I asked if that was enough. He said it was a beginning. That beginnings were what the work was made of. What they were doing, I understood gradually and never completely, was working against something old. Sauron's influence in the East was not what it looked like in the West. In the West, in the accounts I heard later from those who had been closer to that history, Sauron's power expressed itself through domination, through the specific grammar of a will imposing itself on other wills, through rings and armies, and the direct application of a force that left its mark visibly on everything it touched. In the East it was different. It was older and quieter and more thoroughly embedded. It was not a presence so much as a shape, a way that the structures of power and loyalty and meaning had been arranged across centuries to produce specific outcomes, to direct the peoples of the East toward uses that served purposes they were not aware of serving. The kings of the Eastern peoples did not think of themselves as Sauron's instruments. They thought of themselves as kings. The tributaries and the conscriptions and the specific hierarchies that kept certain peoples poor and certain peoples powerful had been in place for so long that they had ceased to look like arrangements and had come to look like the natural order of things. The Elder and the Wanderer were working to show people the difference, not through force, not through the kind of direct application of Maya power that would have been noticed and countered, through the slower and less visible work of changing how people understood what they were part of, planting different ideas about the nature of service and the origins of obligation, supporting the people within the existing structures who were already asking the questions that the structures were designed to prevent. It was the most patient work I have ever witnessed, and I have witnessed it across 60 years. The first divergence came in the 23rd year. There was a kingdom in the northeast, not large but strategically important, whose king was a man called Avar of the Red Hills, and Avar was at a crossroads of the kind that the Elder and the Wanderer had been working toward for years. He was powerful enough to make a significant shift in the tributary arrangements of his region, and aware enough of what he was part of to be considering it. The question was how to support that shift without making it visible enough to draw counter-pressure from the interests that benefited from the current arrangement. The Elder believed the approach was to work through Avar directly, to give him the understanding and the confidence to move himself with minimal visible assistance. The work invested in Avar was significant, and the return on it, if he moved, would reshape the relationships of 7 smaller peoples who looked to him for orientation. The Wanderer believed this was wrong. Not the goal, but the method. His argument, which I heard because I was present for the conversation that should have been private and that I have never told either of them I overheard, was that building the work on a single king was a fundamental error. That kings died. That the arrangements a king made could be unmade by the king's successor. That the only changes that persisted were changes that lived below the level of kings, in the practices and the beliefs and the self-understanding of ordinary people who would continue to exist regardless of who sat on the throne. They disagreed. Not angrily. With the specific quality of disagreement between people who respect each other and have arrived at genuinely different conclusions, and know that the difference is not resolvable through further argument. Avar moved. The elder's approach produced the result he had worked toward. 7 tributary relationships shifted, and the change persisted for a generation. The Wanderer acknowledged this without conceding the point. He said a generation was not long enough. The question was not whether the approach worked, but whether it would still be working in 200 years. I know the answer now because I have seen the 200 years. Avar's changes persisted through his reign and through his sons, and were substantially reversed under his grandson, who had no memory of the arrangement before Avar, and no particular reason to maintain a change whose origins he did not know. The Wanderer had been right, but the Elder had also been right, in the way that right and right can coexist across different time scales, and knowing this didn't make the Wanderer's approach obviously better, only differently right. This was when I began to understand that the mission they had been sent on was not one that admitted a single correct method, and that the two of them knew this, and that they had been sent together not because the mission required 2 of them to do the same thing, but because the mission was large enough and complex enough to require 2 different answers applied simultaneously across generations. In the years around the 40th, I saw the Wanderer more frequently than usual, because his roots through the steppe brought him into the same territory I was working in with the Elder. I watched him in those years with the specific attention of someone who has been absent from a person long enough that the changes have accumulated to visibility. He moved differently. This sounds like a small thing, and it is not a small thing. The way a person moves through a landscape tells you how they understand their relationship to it, whether they are passing through or part of it, whether the ground beneath them is a surface they are crossing or a place they inhabit. The Wanderer moved through the steppe the way the steppe peoples moved through it, with the specific quality of someone whose body has learned a landscape over years, who knows without thinking where the ground is soft and where it is hard, who reads the weather in the quality of the light and the behavior of the animals and the direction of the grasses. He had been learning the steppe for 40 years, and the steppe had been learning him. The exchange was visible in the way he sat on a horse, in the way he read the horizon, in the specific way he was still when stillness was required and moving when movement was required, calibrated to the rhythms of a way of life that was not the life he had been sent from. On one of those crossings, I camped with him for 4 nights, while a late-season storm made travel inadvisable. I had not spent extended time alone with the Wanderer since the early years when we had all traveled together, and the 4 nights gave me something the brief message exchanges had not, which was an unhurried sense of what he had become. He talked about the steppe peoples, the way you talk about people you have loved for a long time and understand well, with the specific combination of clarity and tenderness that comes from knowing someone's faults and finding them insufficient reason to love them less. He knew their histories going back further than their own oral traditions went. He knew the specific shape of the injustices that had been done to them across centuries, and the specific ways those injustices had shaped the people they were now, which qualities were responses to suffering, and which were older than the suffering, and which were simply the texture of who they had always been. He said something on the 3rd night that I have carried ever since. He said the peoples of the West thought of the East as the place where Sauron's influence ran unchecked, as a darkness that needed light brought to it from outside. He said this was exactly wrong. He said the East had its own light, had always had its own light, and that his work was not to bring something absent, but to protect something present from being extinguished. that the distinction mattered more than anything else he had learned in 40 years. I wrote it down that night by the fire. I still have it. The elder noticed it too. He said, once, that the Wanderer was becoming the East's answer to a question the East hadn't known it was asking. I did not fully understand this at the time. I understand it better now. After the disagreement about Avar, they began to spend more time apart. I traveled primarily with the elder in the years that followed, partly because his work was more rooted in specific places and therefore easier for me to be useful in, partly because he asked me to and the Wanderer did not, which was itself a difference between them. The elder wanted a witness. The Wanderer wanted a collaborator when he needed one, and silence when he did not. I was better suited to witnessing, but I carried messages between them every few years, and in the carrying of messages I saw the Wanderer at intervals long enough that the changes in him were visible in a way they would not have been to someone who saw him daily. He was becoming something the elder was not becoming. Not worse, not less. Something specifically itself, specific to the steppe peoples and their ways and their understanding of the world, shaped by 40 years of moving with people who moved, of thinking the way people think when they have no permanent place, and therefore no permanent categories. The elder was becoming more settled, more deeply embedded in the specific culture of the Northeast, more fluent in its particular understanding of meaning and obligation, and the right relationship between people and power. He was becoming, in a way I found difficult to name but impossible to miss, an Eastern thing. Not a Western thing in the East, an Eastern thing that had arrived from the West and had become something the East had made. The Wanderer was becoming something else, something the steppe had made that the steppe itself did not have a word for, because the steppe peoples had never encountered anything that had lived with them long enough and openly enough to be changed by them in the way the Wanderer was being changed. I asked the elder once, in the 47th year, whether they would return to the West. He was quiet for a long time before he answered, which was not his usual way. He usually answered quickly, the speed of his processing so far beyond ordinary that delays were always meaningful, always indicated that the question had reached something he was genuinely uncertain about, rather than something he simply had not yet translated into words. He said he did not think returning was the right frame for what he was doing. I asked him what the right frame was. He said he had come to the East to address something that had been wrong here for a very long time. That the addressing of it was not a task with a defined end point, that every generation of the peoples he worked with required the work to begin again, because what he was working against was not a specific arrangement that could be permanently dismantled, but a tendency in how power organized itself, that reasserted itself whenever the specific counter-pressure was removed. He said he was the counter-pressure. I asked if that meant he would be here forever. He said he did not know what forever meant for something like him in a situation like this. That he had been sent with a purpose, and the purpose had turned out to be larger than what had been explained to him, and he was inside the largeness now, and could not see the edge of it from where he stood. I sat with that for a long time. The Wanderer's answer, when I asked him the same question 2 years later, on one of the steppe crossings where we occasionally met, was shorter. He said the peoples he traveled with had no concept of returning because they never stopped moving. That returning required a fixed point of origin, and he no longer had one. I asked if he missed the West. He said he missed certain things the way you miss the specific quality of light in a place you grew up, without wanting to go back and live there again. that the East had given him things the West did not have, and the exchange had been, on balance, the right one. I did not ask whether Valinor would agree. I should tell you something about what it was to spend a life alongside them, since I have been describing what they did and what they became, and have said less about what that meant for the person watching it happen. I was 14 when I met them, and I am 76 now, and the arithmetic of that is not complicated. They have been the context of my adult life in the way that a landscape is the context of a life lived within it, so present and so constant that the question of what I would have been without them is one I cannot meaningfully answer, because there is no version of me that developed separately from the experience of knowing them. What I felt for them was not what you feel for ordinary people. Not friendship exactly, though friendship was present in it. Not reverence, though I was aware at every point of the gap between what they were and what I was. Something more specific than either. The feeling of someone who has been trusted with something valuable and has tried to be worthy of the trust, who has been given access to something rare, and has understood that the access was a privilege and has tried to behave accordingly. I will tell you what it cost, because it cost something, and I would not be honest if I left that out. I had a wife for 22 years, a woman from the Ash River people called Sarah, who was patient and intelligent, and who understood what my life was and accepted it without pretending it was easy. She died in the 44th year of a fever that moved through the eastern settlements that season and took many people, and I was not there when it happened. I was 3 weeks east with the elder, and by the time word reached me, and I had made the journey back, she had been buried for a month. I had a daughter who grew up largely without me, and who became a trader on the eastern roads, as her family had always been, which was the right life for her, and who I am proud of in the specific way of a parent who knows they do not fully deserve the person their child became. She is alive still, and we write to each other, and it is enough. Or I have made my peace with it, being enough, which may not be the same thing. The two beings I spent my life alongside will outlast my daughter and her children and the generations after them. They do not experience loss the way I have experienced it. This is not a complaint. It is simply a fact about the nature of what they are and what I am, and what it means to spend a human life alongside something that does not measure time in human units. I knew this when I said yes on that hillside at 14, and I would say yes again. But I knew the cost later, and I think it is worth naming. They were not unchanged by knowing me either. I believe this, though I cannot prove it. The elder said once, in the 52nd year, that I had given him something no other companion had given him, which was the specific kind of knowledge that comes from watching a human life complete itself, from following one person from youth to age, and observing everything that changed and everything that did not. He said it had given him a different understanding of what the Eastern peoples were and what they needed than the long view he could take from his own position. That the short view, the human scale, was a form of knowledge he could not replicate from the inside. I think he was being generous, but I also think he was not wrong. I am old now in the way that men are old, moving toward the end of a life that has been longer than most, because I have had better food and better medicine and better luck than most, and because the two beings I have spent my life alongside have a quality in their presence that seems to slow the ordinary processes of decay in the things around them, as if time moves slightly, differently near them, which may be my imagination, and may not be. The Elder is still in the northeast. He has outlasted 6 dynasties, and is working now with the 7th. The specific arrangements he has built and rebuilt across 60 years are more deeply embedded than anything Avar managed in his lifetime, not because the Elder is more powerful than Avar was, but because 60 years of consistent patient work build something that a king's single reign cannot build. The Wanderer moves. He is somewhere on the steppe, I am told, though the steppe is large, and his movements are not the kind that produce reliable reports. The peoples who know him as a permanent presence, in the way that certain features of the landscape are permanent presences, expected to be somewhere without being expected to be anywhere specific. Neither of them is coming back to the West. I have thought about what this means across the years, and I have arrived at no single conclusion that satisfies me, which may itself be the conclusion. They were sent on a mission by powers that understood the West, and had a Western understanding of what the mission required, and what completing it would look like. What they found when they arrived was something that the Western understanding had not fully accounted for. An East that was not simply the West's frontier, but a world with its own depth and its own gravity, that pulled at things that entered it and shaped them according to its own logic. They were sent to change the East. The East changed them instead, or in addition, and the 2 changes happened simultaneously across 60 years. And the result is not what was sent from Valinor, and is not simply Eastern either. It is something that came from the meeting of the 2 that could not have existed without both, that belongs to neither. I do not know if that is failure. I do not know if the powers that sent them would call it failure. They went east and did not return. I know what they became. It was not what was planned. It was not failure. It was something the West sent 2 of its finest into the world to accomplish, and the world, as it tends to do, turned out to be more complicated than the plan. They are still out there, still working. I do not know if the powers that sent them will ever know what they became. I do not know if those powers would have a word for it. I am not sure the West has ever stayed anywhere long enough to need the word that would describe what happens to something Western when it goes deep enough into something Eastern and stays long enough to be changed by it. What I know is this: the East is a different place than it was. The structures Sauron built over centuries have been worn at from the inside in ways that are not yet visible from the outside, and may not become visible for a long time. The peoples of Rhûn carry in their traditions the fingerprints of 2 beings who came from the West and chose, each in their own way, to stay. That is not nothing. I have spent 60 years watching it happen, and I am certain it is not nothing. The East is a different place than it was when 2 figures appeared on the ridge above the Kell River on a morning in early spring, and a 14-year-old boy with no direction of his own looked up from his breakfast and found one. I never did find that goat.